time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And also from the book of Exodus. After the people have crossed over into the desert from the Red Sea, Moses sang this song. Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider God has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and God has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise that God. My father's God, and I will exalt that God. Yahweh is a warrior, and Yahweh is God's name. Pharaoh's chariots and Pharaoh's armies he has cast into the sea, has picked up his officers were sunk into the Red Sea. The floods covered them, and they went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood in a heap, and the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew your wind, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love you led the people whom you redeemed, and you guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples heard, they trembled. Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm they became still as stone, until your people, O Yahweh, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by. You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your possession, the place, O Yahweh, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Yahweh, that your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. When the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his chariot drivers were into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider God has thrown into the sea. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of this word. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable unto you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. To everything there is a season. Spring made its official calendar showing, and we're still waiting. When will it be time for spring? When will our wintering morning turn into springtime dancing? At our house, we actually did make some maple syrup yesterday. Even in the 20-degree weather, it was nice and warm around the fire. And if the weather gets above freezing again, we'll make it again. In our traverse through the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes during Lent, we have considered a time to live and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to build and a time to tear down, a time to weep and a time to laugh. And today we look at a time to mourn and a time to dance. The Lenten journey is like that. We focus on these Sundays during Lent on that mourning part, that kind of introspective, that time of looking at the reality of our life and our mortality, and we wait until Easter before we get into the dancing. If we are an athlete, the distance between mourning and dancing can be measured in hundredths of a second. There was the NC2A swimming and diving championships this past weekend, and we saw, I was watching these things online, and my mind went back to seeing somebody finish in third place at the section championship meet, and she was weeping there, having just finished in third place because she was 1/100th of a second off of the qualifying time for the state meet. And so here she was, having been the third person, done her very best time, but just that much off. And so her celebration and weeping and dancing are just that far apart. We call the NCAA tournament the dance. And a last-minute shot can mean the difference between dancing and mourning. Psalm 30, verse 11 says of God, "You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and girded me with gladness." Mourning and dancing, even though they can be split so finely, can be just like two polar opposites. There is a time for each. There is an inappropriate time for each as well, namely dancing when we should be mourning. Think of the dancing and the celebration of teams storming the field after capturing the World Series. There's great dancing that happens on the field, and then the cameras pan out to the opposing team's dugout, where it's not the same kind of celebration. Mourning and dancing juxtaposed. One of the haunting scenes from the musical version of A Christmas Carol way back in 1970 is one of people who owed money to Scrooge dancing on his coffin when miserly old Scrooge, and they're singing, "Thank you very much, thank you very much, that's the nicest thing that anyone's ever done for me," as they're singing on his coffin. And Scrooge, the whole town joins in the revelry, including clueless Scrooge, who rightly thinks that it's a celebration of him. But it's a celebration of his death. It won an Oscar, actually, for Best Song in 1970. It's the same sentiment of ding dong, the witch is dead, witch old witch, the witch. Here the Munchkins all sing because someone else has died. Mourning turned into dancing. Word has reached, as we all know by now, across the airwaves that Fred Phelps of Westboro Baptist Church has died. He was the mastermind of the church, largely made up of his family, who liked to go around protesting at funerals. Awful signs saying things like "Thank God for AIDS" and "Matt Shepard in hell" and "Fag Church" and on and on and on. At first they were protesting gay and lesbian funerals, but then they came to protesting military funerals and the funerals of diplomats. He threatened to protest at Paul Wellstone's funeral over here at Williams Arena, but never showed up. His entourage did show up for young April England's memorial service several years ago, for some reason. She was the daughter of the pastor of First Baptist Church of St. Paul, who died in a house fire, and where the connection was, I don't know. Luckily, the city had relegated them to several blocks away, and no one really noticed their presence. He made funerals a time for mourning, a time for rage and outrage. His colorful signs looked like they were going to a carnival. I encountered him and his family many times and was close enough to hear that rage and to see those small children carrying those flags. And to add insult to injury, they were singing Baptist hymns in four-part harmony. I had been a human shield at his protests, mostly to keep people from being violent toward him and his family. knowing that everything was being caught on tape and they were really trying to egg people on to see how violent these pro-LGBT people are. Over the years, his protests backfired, I think. They garnered more sympathy for the LGBT community and military service people. Someone once said, "I hope I live my life audacious enough that Westboro Baptist Church protests at my funeral." He also gave Baptists a really bad name. How many of us, when we talked about being Baptists, have seen the looks in the other people's eyes and those colorful signs and says, "I'm not that kind of Baptist." And now, in the wake of his death, people are having to wrestle with whether to pay him back as he paid so many others. Will we dance at his funeral? Will we mourn? Or will we ignore it? Or will we remember that a sad, broken man has died? We mourn with his family out of compassion. And out of that same compassion, we will redouble our efforts to fight the discrimination that still exists in Uganda and in even some of our communities that's the same, if not as colorful, school of thought. The Israelites in the scripture I just read turned their mourning into dancing on the other side of the Red Sea. They were mourning over their cruel treatment under the Egyptian slavery. And for centuries they worked under such harsh conditions, and they had no freedom, no land to call their own, no human rights, only a trust in a distant God that would one day deliver them. When their freedom actually happened, there was great rejoicing for a couple of reasons. For their freedom of looking at the distant promised land promised to their ancestors, looking at how God had worked through Moses to part the Red Sea so that the people could pass by on dry land, and afterwards just to the delight in seeing their tormentors, the symbols of their captivity, the army, wiped out by the ensuing waves of the Red Sea coming back into its own. The Exodus story recounts how God gives the Egyptian armies every opportunity to turn back, and yet they're determined to pursue and subdue the Israelites. One would think after 10 plagues they would see how futile such a search would be, and yet with dogged determination they pressed on, blinded by their need for revenge. Revenge seldom fixes problems. It almost always makes the problems get worse. We know what happens to the revenge-minded, and we wish they would learn a lesson, and we wish our leaders would learn the same lesson. And so Moses sang a song. Miriam took her tambourine and danced. It was a great day of deliverance. The dreaded Egyptians were finally defeated. But this celebration was too much for the rabbinical scholars to take. And a midrash in the Babylonian Talmud portrays God's anger at the Israelite people, saying, "Why are you rejoicing when my children have died?" as Paula said in her prayer. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. May our dancing never silence the mourning of those who are grieving. That, too, is holy work. When you're in mourning, it's really hard to dance. Heck, it's hard to do anything, really. Getting out of bed is a chore. Nothing makes sense anymore. We have to be reminded to eat. We find our minds drifting. We find ourselves numb and dumb. And if we're lucky enough, we find a community that will help pull us through. Someone will knit a prayer shawl and give it to us. Someone will show up with food. A phone call or a Facebook post or a visit will bring healing balm. The best word is often the knowing response that it's hard, and we're not going to fill up the void with a platitude. I was a student chaplain in a New York hospital while I was in seminary, and I was assigned for a couple of weeks to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and was called upon to be present when a small child had died. His mother held his limp body in her arms and sang to him one last time while we all wept. It was a holy moment of grief. I said a brief prayer, And as they were getting ready to clean everything up, no one quite seemed to know what to say because there really were no words. And finally a nurse said, "You're young. You can have another baby." To which she shot back, "My tubes were tied." Sometimes we just need to be there, giving them time to mourn. There'll be a time for dancing, but not anytime soon. One of my favorite writers is Anne Lamott. She wrote that I have survived so much loss, as all of us have by now, my parents, my pets, my dear friends. Rubble is the ground on which our deepest friendships are built. If you haven't already, you will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. The bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of a beloved person. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up, and you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, and you learn to dance with a limp. You dance to the absurdities of life. You dance to the minuet of old friendships. Do we need to turn our mourning into dancing? Maybe there is a time to mourn and a time to dance, but maybe doing a quick turnaround is not the right thing. Maybe there's a time for each. A time to mourn and a time to dance. Not all dance is celebratory. Dance is also a kind of expression. It's embodied movement. It's sometimes choreographed, sometimes not. And sometimes when I watch the bell choir play, it seems like a dance. And I have great respect for dancers who can get it. I think of folk dancers and people that dance in clubs and people who do contra dancing, liturgical dances. This is a great space for liturgical dancing. And if Allison was here, I'd have her come and do a dance or something. It's all about expression and freedom that does not need words. That's the thing about both dancing and mourning. Neither necessitate words, and both can be convulsive, cathartic, gestaltic, they bring healing. Someone said, was it Mark Twain or Satchel Paige? I don't know. But there's wisdom in it. Dance like no one is watching. Love like you've never been hurt. Sing like no one is listening. Live like it's heaven on earth. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Pick your time. Big blockbuster movie in 1984 was Footloose. Remember that? Where all that teenage angst was there with all sorts of hormones and everything kind of flooding over. And they all wanted to dance. And there was the stuck-up preacher who was stuck in his mourning, telling people that it was not time to dance. And throughout the film, as people found their voices and found their movement, even the preacher at the end found his dance moves. Nora Astorga, one of the Sandinista Nicaraguan revolutionaries, said, "If the revolution does not have dancing, I don't want to be a part of it." So while there is a time for mourning and a time for dancing, there's a lot of in-between time. It's there that we remember who we are. We remember that someone's mourning and someone is dancing, and all need our support. It can take years to get you from mourning to dancing. Sometimes all you can do is mourn. And sometimes all you can do is dance to block out the mourning and remind yourself that you're alive and creative and brave. What time is it? Is it a time to live, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance? Or maybe it's just a time to be. Maybe we don't live in those extremes. Maybe it's time to be content with who and where you are. We moved here way back in 2001. Our kids were 2 years old and 4 years old. And as we made the transition, there were many nights when the kids mourned over their friends and mourned over the predictability of their lives and would cry to us as they were trying to go to sleep, "I want to go back to my pink house." Our house was salmon and teal in San Francisco. But we moved back here in part to be closer to family and to start this new adventure with all of you, and it's been a wonderful adventure. But one of the things that we did also was we wanted to be closer to our Cleveland family. And we had 3 of the kids' grandparents that were still living at that time, and we wanted to make sure we could get back and forth many times, and we did over the years. Now only one of them remains. One of the things we got the chance to do was to drive to a lot of the Baptist Peace Fellowship summer conferences. And that first summer that we were here, the conference was in Oberlin College. And there were heavy days that we were dealing with all the problems of the world, including going back up to a 4th floor dormitory with no air conditioning and no elevator, with 2 small children that were really tired. But as day turned to night in the dusk in northern Ohio, things that we had never seen, that the kids had never seen before, but of course we grew up with, started to emerge in those sticky July nights, and those were fireflies. We hardly see fireflies up in this area anymore, but we saw them a lot when we were growing up. And my mind went back to all those evenings with parents and grandparents and other people who have gone before, watching the children dance among the fireflies. And our children would go around the quad at Oberlin dancing with those fireflies. And now here we are, these many years later, and those same children are now getting ready to attend colleges that they were just there as little children. And I imagine them dancing with fireflies and dancing, and just that kind of wonderful abandon and that kind of freedom that they had, and the laughter. And I imagine the generations who have gone before looking on them and celebrating with them. I saw in them a mirror of myself, running around at dusk without a care, catching the fireflies that always evaded me. Peace is not only looking at what's wrong with the world and organizing, it's also about dancing with the fireflies those kids taught us. To let the world and abandon and discovery and joy pervade our life and invade us. And as I watch the fireflies, I remember those that have gone before. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance, my friends. May you mourn, and may you find room for that child within you that longs to dance with the fireflies. For everything there is a season. Amen.